Let me tell y'all something right now. The world done seen a lot of diplomacy. A lot of suits, ties, flashbulbs, and soft talking behind closed doors. But what just happened up north? That ain't diplomacy. That was fireworks. That was truth served ice cold with that Canadian politeness wrapped around a sledgehammer of reality. That was a moment in history where a nation, our neighbors to the north, stood on the global stage, looked hypocrisy dead in the face, and hit it with a beat, a lyric, a message so sharp it had the whole world doing a double take like they just witnessed the most elegant takedown in diplomatic history. And they didn't even need to raise their voice. Their words did all the damage they needed to do. See, you know what happens when a nation's patience runs thin, when they've been the good neighbor for too long, when they've been nodding along, staying quiet, playing the role of the polite friend while watching their southern neighbor throw tantrums on the world stage. One day they stop playing nice. One day the maple syrup gloves come off, and when that nation has been consistently underestimated, consistently overlooked, and constantly treated like the quiet sibling who should just go along to get along, oh, they're going to serve some reality. That's what Canada just did. Now picture this scene, a packed room full of international reporters, diplomats, global power brokers. Everybody got their morning coffee, their prepared questions, their predictable talking points, and then somebody throws out that tired old accusation. Why isn't Canada falling in line? Why won't Canada just follow America's lead on this issue? Why are they questioning our approach? Why won't they just trust our judgment like they used to? And Canada's representative, they don't get flustered. They don't start sweating. They smile, that signature Canadian smile, listen with that famous Canadian patience, and then they lean forward and drop this line. You ever heard that song, Man in the Mirror by Michael Jackson? Dead silence. What did they just say, Michael Jackson? Yes, they did. Because while everybody else in that room was quoting policy papers and international law textbooks, Canada just reached into the heart of the conversation. They didn't bring statistics. They brought soul. They didn't bring aggression. They brought that mirror of truth. That line, I'm starting with the man in the mirror. I'm asking him to change his ways. That wasn't just a lyric anymore. That was a mirror being held up to their southern neighbor, reflecting back decades of contradictions and double standards. See, that's the brilliance of it. They weren't just dropping a random pop culture reference. They were rewriting the entire conversation. You asking why Canada doesn't automatically echo your foreign policy, why Canada doesn't rubber stamp your military adventures, why Canada asks questions instead of just saluting. Brother, maybe you need to take a long, hard look at yourself first. Maybe before you question our sovereignty, you need to examine your own track record. Let's talk about that mirror, because some folks really don't want to see what's staring back at them. The United States talks about freedom and democracy like they patented the concepts. But go ask the people of Central America what freedom looked like when American companies needed their resources. Go ask the Middle East what democracy felt like when it came with cruise missiles and regime change. Go ask South America how many elected governments got the American seal of approval versus how many got the CIA treatment. And yet they want to lecture Canada about international norms and global responsibility. Canada, a country that builds hospitals instead of bombing them. Canada, a country that welcomes refugees instead of caging children. Canada, a country that apologizes for historical wrongs instead of denying they ever happened. Canada was saying, if you want to talk about moral leadership, let's start with your own reflection. Don't come to us with righteousness while your own foreign policy reads like a horror novel. Don't play the victim while you're the one with military bases on every continent. You want to talk about following international law? Let's pull up the receipts on every treaty you've walked away from, every agreement you've torn up, every promise you've broken when it became inconvenient. And it wasn't delivered with anger. It was delivered with that distinctly Canadian combination of politeness and precision. That kind of clarity that doesn't come from briefing books, that comes from watching your neighbor for decades, that comes from a nation that's seen the pattern, recognized the contradictions, and decided they're not going to pretend anymore. This isn't the Canada that automatically says yes to keep the peace. This is the Canada that's found its voice and isn't afraid to use it, even when it means telling uncomfortable truths to the most powerful nation on earth. Now let's break down the genius of that Michael Jackson reference. Man in the Mirror isn't just a song about personal reflection. It's about taking responsibility for change, starting with yourself. It's about stopping the finger pointing and starting the hard work of honest self-examination. Canada wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. They were turning on the lights. They were saying, we're making decisions based on what's best for our people and our values. We're talking to multiple nations because that's what sovereign countries do. We're not here to be your automatic yes man. We're here to be your neighbor, your partner, but also your mirror when you need one. And that room full of international observers, they didn't know whether to applaud or hold their breath because they realized something fundamental. Tal had shifted. This isn't the Canada of the 1950s that followed American foreign policy like a younger sibling. This isn't the Canada that stays quiet to avoid making waves. This is the Canada that will look the most powerful nation in the world in the eye and say, we respect you, but we won't enable you. We'll partner with you, but we won't be controlled by you. The American media tried to spin it as anti-American sentiment. No, this was pro-Canadian sovereignty. This was pro-independent thinking. This was pro-doing what's right instead of what's expected. What really bothered them wasn't that Canada disagreed. What bothered them was that Canada disagreed so eloquently, so calmly, and so effectively that it made everyone else in the room start questioning things too. This is what burns up the old power structure. The fact that their closest ally, their most reliable partner, their next-door neighbor who shares the longest undefended border in the world is no longer content to just nod along. The fact that Canada isn't just following orders anymore, they're setting examples, and they can't figure out how a country known for being polite can stand up in a room full of international pressure and quote an American pop legend while simultaneously exposing American foreign policy contradictions. That, my friends, is what you call diplomatic poetry. And let's not miss the deeper symbolism here. Michael Jackson was beloved globally, transcending politics and borders. His message about looking inward before judging others resonated across cultures and continents. So when Canada quoted him, they weren't appealing just to American sensibilities. They were appealing to universal human conscience. They were saying, we all have mirrors. Some of us just have the courage to look into them honestly. They thought Canada would fold under pressure, that the economic threats would be too much. Trade disputes here, diplomatic pressure there, phone calls from Washington, stern warnings from think tanks. And yet Canada stood firm, calm, principled, and unapologetic. Because when your foundation is built on genuine values instead of convenient politics, external pressure becomes irrelevant. Canada proved that principle over power, values over expediency, and truth over temporary advantage. Now let me tell you what the American foreign policy establishment can't handle right now. They can't handle that their old playbook doesn't work anymore. You see, they used to pull out phrases like national security, global stability, shared values, and expect their allies to fall in line automatically. But today, those phrases ring hollow when they come from a country that applies them selectively, that uses them to justify actions that contradict the very values they claim to represent. Canada saw through that. Canada called it out. They said, in essence, you want us to support your actions? Show us how those actions align with the values you claim to champion. You invaded countries and called it liberation, then ask us to trust your judgment. You armed dictatorships while preaching democracy, then question our moral compass. You abandoned international agreements when they became inconvenient, then lecture us about global responsibility. Come on now, that doesn't even make sense. See, this is what authentic leadership looks like. It's not just about defending your national interest. It's about defining your national character. And right now, Canada is defining itself as independent, thoughtful, and principled. No longer reactive, no longer automatically deferential. And their representative who delivered that Michael Jackson moment, they're the voice of that transformation. A diplomat who can reference Shakespeare and hip-hop in the same breath, who can quote pop culture while dismantling foreign policy hypocrisy. That's versatility, that's power. Because while others use complexity to confuse, they use simplicity to clarify. And let's be clear, when Canada speaks up like this, it's not just for Canada, it's for every ally that's been taken for granted, for every partner nation that's been handed ultimatums disguised as consultations, For every democracy that's been told to choose sides instead of choosing principles. When they said, look in the mirror, what they really meant was, stop being shocked when we act like the sovereign nation we've always been. Start being honest about why that threatens you. That takes real courage, because we know what happens to allies who speak truth to American power. They get targeted economically, isolated diplomatically, criticized in international forums. But Canada doesn't flinch anymore. They've been through the pressure campaigns. They've been in rooms where eyes roll when they raise uncomfortable questions. But now those same eyes are watching closely, because Canada isn't whispering diplomatic niceties anymore. Canada is speaking clearly and confidently, and they're not asking for permission to do what's right. Don't mistake politeness for weakness. Don't confuse diplomatic courtesy with automatic compliance. Canada doesn't need American approval to make decisions that benefit Canadian citizens, doesn't need Washington's validation to act on Canadian values, and they sure don't need lectures about global responsibility from a country that walks away from international agreements whenever they become inconvenient. This moment, this quote, this man in the mirror reference, it's going down in diplomatic history, not just because it was clever, but because it was devastatingly accurate. Because it flipped the script without flipping the table, because it reminded everyone in that room that moral authority isn't inherited, it's earned. And if your actions don't match your rhetoric, if your foreign policy contradicts your stated values, then that mirror is going to reflect some uncomfortable truths. So here we are witnessing a new chapter in international relations. Canada isn't dancing to someone else's tune anymore. They're composing their own symphony, and they're not afraid to sample some Michael Jackson while doing it. The world better take notice, because when a nation finds its authentic voice, when it stops apologizing for having principles, when it produces leaders bold enough to speak truth through diplomatic noise, there's no containing that influence. They thought they could control the narrative, set the tempo, dictate the terms, but now they're realizing Canada brought their own rhythm to the dance. Canada didn't challenge America to a confrontation, but they did challenge America to finally look in that mirror. And that one move, that one cultural reference, turned the entire diplomatic conversation upside down. See, for decades, international relations were built on power dynamics. Who's got more economic leverage, more military bases, more influence over international institutions? But Canada flipped that whole model. They didn't step onto the global stage to intimidate or threaten. They didn't point fingers and demand apologies. No, they did something far more effective. They asked the world's most powerful nation to pause, reflect, and honestly evaluate its own behavior. And that right there is what shook the foreign policy establishment more than any trade war or military posturing ever could. Because when someone asks you to look in the mirror, it's not an attack, it's not a debate tactic. It's an invitation to honesty. And honesty in international relations is the one thing that makes everyone uncomfortable. Nations survive on narratives. They build their legitimacy on carefully crafted stories about their role in the world. But a mirror, that's different. A mirror doesn't care about how noble your intentions sound or how impressive your military budget is. A mirror shows reality. Unfiltered, uncomfortable, unavoidable. When Canada's representatives stood in front of those international journalists and policymakers and made that cultural reference to Michael Jackson's Man in the Mirror, they weren't being cute or trying to go viral. They were being surgical. They knew exactly what they were doing. They understood that invoking a universally beloved cultural icon wasn't about entertainment value. It was about truth-telling. That song wasn't just a clever quote. It was a precision-guided message aimed directly at the heart of American foreign policy contradictions. The United States has long positioned itself as the world's moral compass, the defender of democracy, the keeper of international order. But what happens when your closest ally, your most trusted partner, turns the spotlight around and asks, before you judge everyone else's behavior, have you taken an honest look at your own? That's what Canada did. And I did it without raised voices, without personal attacks, without diplomatic tantrums. That's the artistry of it. They used a pop culture reference to slice through decades of accumulated hypocrisy. Because let's be real, America loves to lecture the world about human rights, about freedom, about international law. But those lectures lose their power when they come from a country with a documented history of violating those same principles whenever they conflicted with national interests. You overthrow governments and call it promoting stability. You support authoritarian regimes and call it strategic partnership. You ignore international law when it's inconvenient and invoke it when it serves your purposes. Canada didn't say those things directly. They didn't have to. That's what the mirror accomplishes. The mirror doesn't accuse or attack. It simply reflects. And when Canada subtly suggested that America might benefit from some self-reflection, they held up that mirror for the whole world to see. They created a moment of silence, a pause in the usual diplomatic theater. They turned the scrutiny inward, and the brilliance of it was undeniable because nobody could argue with the message. They didn't package it as confrontation or criticism. They packaged it as an invitation to growth, to honesty, to self-awareness. That's what made it so powerful and so unsettling. The international community wasn't used to this kind of diplomacy. They were accustomed to either submissive agreement or angry opposition. But this was elegant resistance. This was diplomatic jujitsu. This was using America's own cultural exports to highlight America's own contradictions. Canada made it crystal clear that they will not be bullied into binary choices in a multipolar world. They will not accept lectures about international behavior from a country that has refused to learn from its own historical mistakes. They will not pretend that American exceptionalism justifies American double standards. And Mirror made that message resonate because once it's held up, it becomes impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, impossible to deflect. Suddenly people start remembering inconvenient truths. Vietnam, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Chile, Iran, Guatemala. The list stretches across continents and decades. Every one of those interventions represents a crack in the moral authority America claims to possess. Canada didn't need to recite that history lesson. They simply reminded everyone that it exists, that it's documented, that hypocrisy doesn't disappear just because you change the subject or update your talking points. What made it even more impactful was that it came from Canada. This wasn't some rival nation or historical enemy throwing stones. This was family calling out family. This was the neighbor who knows you best, who's seen you at your worst, who's been quietly supportive through your mistakes, finally saying, enough, time to be honest about who you really are and how you really behave. Canada isn't some outsider trying to score political points. They're the ally who's been in the room for every major decision, who's seen the classified briefings, who understands the real motivations behind the public rhetoric. And so when they speak, it's not from ignorance or malice, it's from decades of observation, from intimate knowledge of how the system actually works versus how it's supposed to work. That's why the mirror moment hit so differently, because it wasn't aimed just at government officials. It was aimed at the entire ecosystem of American global influence, the media outlets that repeat government talking points without question, the think tanks that provide intellectual cover for questionable policies, the academic institutions that train the next generation of foreign policy professionals to think in terms of American interests rather than universal principles. Canada was saying, in effect, stop pretending to be neutral referees while wearing team uniforms. Stop demanding transparency from others while classifying your own decision-making processes. Stop telling the world how to behave when your own behavior sets the opposite example. That's not aggression. That's not confrontation. That's accountability. And accountability is exactly what the international system has been lacking. For too long, smaller nations and even major allies have been gaslit into silence. Every time they raised legitimate concerns, they were told to focus on their own development. Every time they charted independent courses, they were accused of undermining global stability. But who gets to define that stability? Who benefits when everyone else follows the same playbook? Who profits when the rules only apply to everyone except the rule makers? The mirror revealed all of that uncomfortable reality, and that's why Canada's words resonated far beyond North American diplomacy. Across the globe, from European capitals to African nations, from Asian democracies to Latin American republics, diplomats and citizens alike felt the weight of that moment because it gave voice to what many had been thinking but couldn't say. Maybe it's time to stop letting one nation's interpretation of morality dictate everyone else's behavior. The United States has been used to controlling the conversation, setting the agenda, framing the context. They ask the questions, they establish the parameters, they decide what gets priority attention and what gets ignored. But Canada flipped that dynamic entirely. They reframed the entire discussion. They made the questioner question themselves. They introduced a new paradigm where moral authority has to be earned rather than assumed. And that's why the mirror is such a transformative tool, because once it's positioned correctly, it can't be moved aside. Once the contradictions are illuminated, they can't be hidden again. Once the double standards are exposed, the whole system of assumed moral superiority starts to crumble. What you're left with is something much more valuable than dominance or control. You're left with the possibility of genuine partnership based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical submission. Canada used that mirror like a master craftsman. They didn't attack or threaten. They didn't issue ultimatums or make demands. They simply opened the curtains and let natural light illuminate what was already there. And that light was sufficient to make a lot of powerful people squint uncomfortably, shift in their seats, and reconsider their entire approach to international relations. That's what authentic leadership accomplishes. Real leadership doesn't need to dominate or intimidate. It needs to illuminate and elevate. It needs to bring clarity rather than confusion, truth rather than convenient fiction. And by transforming the conversation from accusation to introspection, Canada demonstrated what mature diplomacy looks like in the 21st century. Not the kind that seeks applause or approval, but the kind that seeks alignment with universal principles and shared human values. And it worked beautifully. Suddenly, the international headlines shifted focus. The narrative cracked open. People began asking different questions, better questions, not just about Canada's independent foreign policy, but about everyone else's assumptions, about who gets to claim moral leadership and why, about what sovereignty really means in an interconnected world, about whether the loudest voices in international forums are necessarily the wisest or most principled. That's when you understand the true power of that mirror moment. It didn't just challenge American assumptions about global leadership, it liberated everyone else from those same assumptions. It granted permission to think independently, speak authentically, act according to national values rather than external expectations. It established a new precedent. If Canada can stand tall and reject the pressure to conform, why can't others? If Canada can prioritize its principles without apologizing, why should anyone else apologize for doing the same? The mirror became a symbol of that liberation, that transformation in international relations, because ultimately the world doesn't need another Cold War or another system of competing blocs. It needs honesty, balance, and genuine mutual respect among sovereign nations. It needs countries to mature beyond the old patterns of dominance and submission. It needs mirrors that reflect truth rather than megaphones that amplify propaganda. Canada held up that mirror not to destroy or humiliate, but to heal and improve the relationship. They showed that real friendship sometimes requires uncomfortable honesty, that genuine partnership demands mutual accountability, and that the strongest alliances are built on shared values rather than shared interests alone. In the end, that's what made their Michael Jackson moment so powerful. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about elevating the entire conversation to a higher level of truth and mutual respect.